Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Caspersight. Yesterday, I had the honour and privilege to have a conversation with Nick Pope, aka the real Fox Mulder. Nick Pope worked for the UK MOD for 21 years, and in between 1991 and 1994, his job was to investigate the UFO phenomena. So in the conversation that we had, we spoke about the New Jersey drone situation, we spoke about alien technology, we spoke about the implications of ET and human race. We also talk about the UK version of the Roswell incident, the Rendlesham forest incident, which happened in 1980, and also the famous Cosford incident that happened in 1993. That and more. Be sure to check out all of Nick Pope's social media links below, and also two books, which is the Rendlesham forest incident and also Blood Brothers, his most recent book, plus his brand new movie, which has just been released on Amazon Prime, Apocalypse COVID. Be sure to check those out. If you're into aliens, UAPs, ghosts, paranormal, things like that, the strange, weird, and wonderful, make sure you subscribe, because this is what we cover on this channel. Enjoy the conversation. Well, Nick Pope, it is absolute pleasure and honor to have you on here. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. We're going to get into a whole bunch of questions. I mean, obviously, the big news at the moment is the New Jersey drone situation, which I do want to talk about. But I think it'll be an insult to not talk about your history. Could you just basically give us an overview for the viewers of what you did, a bit about history?
Sure. Well, I was a civilian employee at the UK Ministry of Defence. I worked there for 21 years, had a number of different postings at progressively higher grade as my career progressed. But the one that I'm best known for is the one that I had from 91 to 94. And essentially, it's colloquially known as the UFO desk, but sometimes UFO program, UFO project. The technical name is Secretariat Air Staff 2 Alpha. But
Wow.
Because that doesn't, yeah, exactly. Typical civil servant kind of, bureaucrat speak. So obviously that's meaningless to just about everyone, even some people in the system, let alone out. Hence, this kind of does what it says on the tin: UFO program, project, desk, whatever. And the job was basically to be the subject matter expert on the topic, to handle policy when defense ministers wanted advice on it, and of course the bread and butter of the job, doing the investigations, but also handling public correspondence, handling parliamentary business, handling media liaison. That was through the press office, but obviously a lot of media interest in this topic. The subject matter expert has to write the lines to take in the key messages. So a whole bunch of different things.
So how did you actually come about getting that job opportunity?
Quite by accident, really. Right place, right time. The vacancy was just about to open up. I was due for a move. I had worked with the particular manager before. During the first Gulf War, people with high security clearances found themselves seconded into the Joint Operations Center to handle the kind of, the duties that we did down there. And I worked quite well with this particular individual. He was the one who had the vacancy. He knew I was looking for a move, and it was just, well, why don't you do a sideways move from one part of the department where I had been into the other part in which the UFO duties were embedded.
So did you, when you heard about this opportunity, because it is quite extreme, isn't it? I mean, you must have been quite excited and nervous at the same time, right?
But yeah, and I had mixed feelings, to be honest.
Yeah.
I was quite keen to get out of the particular area that I had been in, which was dealing with a lot of things like parliamentary aspects of military aircraft accidents, but also a lot of visit briefs for senior personnel, that sort of thing. And I'd done that for around about a year, and frankly, I had another year or two to go, but I was looking to get out of it and wanted a fresh challenge. This came up, but I had mixed feelings, to be honest, because part of me, look, every young, ambitious junior manager wanted to get those jobs in the Secretary of State's office. So those sorts of private office jobs. And UFOs, it sounded very interesting, but a little bit quirky. So at the back of my mind, I was thinking, is this necessarily best in terms of long-term career aspirations? So I wasn't sure about that one, but when it came up, because I'd worked with this particular manager, I felt that, the offer, once the offer had been made, you couldn't really step back from that. And so I did it. I did it for 3 years, and it changed my life. and it was fascinating. And as it happened, I did get a promotion at the end of that. So kind of that was the concern. You were always trying to get up to the next grade.
Yeah. So what was the? I mean, so head of UFO department. What does your average day look like?
I know it's a huge cliche, but there isn't one.
Oh,
but
really?
Kind of, yeah, because it's events led. You see, that's the point. Because the investigations are at the heart of it. Right. So you have a day where several new cases come in, but you might have a day or several consecutive days where no new cases come in at all.
Right.
We got about 200 or 300 a year, but they tended to cluster. So sometimes you did have those periods. So that's why I say it's events led. But let me kind of construct a day as it might have happened, cobbling together things that really did happen. But you know, like a constant character in a drama.
Yeah.
So I'm not making anything up, but there's a little dramatic license to make it flow.
Yeah. Okay.
So I don't know. Get into the office 8 a.m, whatever it was, and obviously duty staff. Some people are working the night shift. And if something happens, anything happens, it could be a UFO sighting, it could be a complaint about noise from military aircraft, could be somebody's died on a military operation or exercise, but there's always somebody, you know, even at 2, 3 in the morning, of course, there are people on duty, and those people take action if necessary, but if not, they leave the subject and say somebody's going to pick this up during the daytime. So get into the office, find that a couple of UFO reports got phoned in, and they would come to me as signals. But you know, this is back in the 90s. Now we sort of think that everything is email, but of course back in the day there was a lot of hard copy paper or signals coming out of a telex machine. Right. So I would find you know, as soon as the registry staff opened things up and brought the contents of your in tray, I would find maybe a couple of signals had come in about sightings reported in the night. So I would take a look. Okay, what does it look like we've got there? And one of the things that I had up on the wall was a big map of the United Kingdom, all the military bases, all the military exercise areas, ranges, danger areas, right. Civilian airports, flight paths, also the notices to airmen. So I would take a quick look, and let's suppose for the sake of this typical day, I would very quickly find an answer. So I would, look, there was a night exercise and they were dropping flares. Let's have a look at these UFO sightings. Yeah, date and time match up. Description, location. Oh, absolutely. They would have been able to see it from there. That's what it is. Case closed.
Right. So is it like is it normally when you get a report of a UFO, is your knee-jerk reaction more so as, okay, this is a potential threat straight away to us, the government, the United Kingdom, or is it this is more unlikely a lantern or a flare, or what's your general feel when you get these reports that come through?
It's two things. Firstly, somebody has done that particular job since 1953. So right. we had a history, and we had a vast archive. Much of which has now been declassified and released. But so historically, we knew that most of these things would turn out to be misidentifications, and the sorts of things. It's bright stars and planets, meteors, satellites, weather balloons, airships.
Right.
Nowadays, it would be Chinese lanterns, it would be drones, it would be Starlink, those sorts of things. So that's, you go in sort of playing the odds, and you think there's a reasonably high percentage probability that you're going to find a conventional explanation. However, historically also, that maybe a small but statistically significant proportion, call it 5%, won't be explained like that. And then you apply, which you do for everything in the military, the threat equation. People are amazed to learn that there is an equation that defines threat.
Right.
And threat equals capability times intent.
I've heard that before, yeah.
Right. The silly example everyone gives is that, hopefully it's silly, is that France has nuclear weapons, so it has capability, but it does not intend to attack the UK.
Let's hope.
So you can say that there's no threat, but the problem arises where you have, in that equation, a nation that has both the capability and the intent to launch an attack on you. So you apply that to UAP, as we call UFOs in government, just as you would apply it across the board to anything, whether it's counterterrorism or
Welcome, everyone, to our deep dive today on a topic that I think is on a lot of people's minds these days.
Absolutely.
UAPs, UFOs, whatever you want to call them. Something strange seems to be happening in our skies.
Yeah, for a long time, this was seen as a fringe topic, right?
Hmm.
But now we have the Pentagon taking it seriously, Congress holding hearings. It's definitely moved into the mainstream.
Totally. And we're not just talking about blurry lights in the sky anymore. We're going to dig into some really specific cases today, cases that have baffled even the experts.
Right, and you've sent over some incredible material, including an interview with someone who knows this subject inside and out.
Yeah, Nick Pope. He headed up the UK's Ministry of Defence's UFO program back in the early 90s. So we're talking about someone with actual government experience investigating these things.
Exactly, and that lends a lot of credibility to what he has to say. He's not just some random guy who saw something weird. He spent years analyzing these reports, separating the hoaxes from the truly unexplained.
And there were a lot of hoaxes, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, a big part of his job was sifting through all the reports, trying to figure out which ones were misidentified aircraft or weather phenomena, and which ones were genuinely unusual.
But it sounds like there are a few cases that even HE couldn't explain.
There were, and those are the ones we're going to focus on today. We'll be looking at the drone swarms over New Jersey that have been making headlines recently, the Rendlesham forest incident, which has been called Britain's Roswell, and a case involving massive black triangles.
Some pretty bizarre stuff. But before we get into those cases, I think it's important to understand a bit more about Nick Pope and his role at the Ministry of Defense. What exactly did his job entail?
So from 1991 to 1994, Pope was tasked with investigating UFO sightings across the UK, assessing potential threats, and advising government officials on the topic. Essentially, he was trying to determine which cases were worth serious investigation and which ones could be safely dismissed.
So it wasn't all lights in the sky and little green men.
Not quite. It sounds like a lot of his work involved going through mountains of paperwork, analyzing radar data, interviewing witnesses, and trying to make sense of often contradictory information.
And you said that a lot of those reports ended up having pretty mundane explanations, right? Like people mistaking planes or satellites for something more exotic.
Absolutely. But as Pope said in that interview, there was always a small percentage of cases that defied easy explanation.
The ones that kept him up at night.
Exactly. Cases with multiple credible witnesses, maybe some physical evidence, or unusual radar readings, those are the ones that really got his attention.
Like the Rendlesham forest incident. That's become almost legendary in UFO circles. Can you set the scene for us?
Okay, so picture this. December 1980, Rendlesham Forest in Suffolk, England. The forest happens to be located right between two U.S. Air Force bases.
Interesting location.
Yeah, and over 3 nights, multiple military personnel stationed at those bases witnessed strange lights in the sky, picked up unusual readings on their radar, and on the first night, something actually landed in the forest.
And it wasn't just some blurry lights in the distance. Pope described finding actual physical traces, right? Like indentations in the ground, burn marks on the trees.
Exactly. They found all sorts of physical evidence that suggested something had definitely landed there.
And one of the details that really stood out to me, and maybe this is because you don't hear about it that often with UFO sightings, is the presence of radiation in the area where the object landed.
Yeah, the radiation is a crucial detail that often gets overlooked in the popular retellings of the Rendlesham incident. But it definitely adds another layer of complexity to the case.
Absolutely. So how high were these radiation readings?
Okay, so according to declassified Ministry of Defense files, the readings were a staggering 6.6 times higher than normal background radiation.
6.6 times. That's pretty significant, I'd say. They measured that right after this object supposedly left.
Yeah, shortly after the incident, they brought in Geiger counters, took readings, and documented it all in the official reports.
Did they ever figure out what caused this spike in radiation?
Nope. That's one of the enduring mysteries of the Rendlesham Forest incident. What landed there, what caused those radiation levels to spike. There are still no definitive answers.
And what about the witnesses? Were there any long-term effects on them from that kind of exposure?
Unfortunately, yes. Some of the witnesses who were closest to the object later reported a range of health issues that they attributed to the radiation exposure. And there have even been legal battles over compensation for those health issues, involving U.S. senators and the declassification of a British intelligence assessment.
Wow. So this wasn't just brushed aside as some crazy conspiracy theory. This was serious business.
Yeah, and it just goes to show how deep this rabbit hole goes. We're talking about potential health consequences, government cover-ups, international investigations.
It sounds like something out of a movie.
Sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, right? But getting back to Nick Pope, now, this incident happened before his time at the Ministry of Defense, but he ended up inheriting the case files, correct?
Yeah, he actually conducted a cold case review of the Rendlesham Forest incident, right? Going through all the available data, the witness testimonies, the radar readings, everything.
He had access to all the classified documents, too, which most researchers could only dream of.
So what was his take on Rendlesham? After all that, did he ever come up with an explanation for what those objects might have been?
Well, Pope was always very careful not to jump to conclusions, but he did say that the Rendlesham case, with its multiple witnesses, the physical evidence, and those radiation readings, was one of the most intriguing and unexplained UFO incidents he had ever come across.
That's saying something, coming from a guy who dedicated years of his life to investigating these phenomena.
Exactly. So if even HE was stumped, it's a pretty compelling case.
So what makes Rendlesham stand out, even among all those other unexplained cases? What earned it the nickname Britain's Roswell?
I think it's a combination of factors. You have these credible witnesses, many of whom were high-ranking military personnel.
Yeah.
You have physical evidence that's not easily dismissed as misidentification or a hoax.
So we're not talking about random people seeing things. These were trained observers in a highly sensitive location.
Precisely. And then you have the duration of the event, the multiple sightings over several nights, and of course, those unexplained radiation readings.
It all adds up to a pretty convincing case that something extraordinary happened in Rendlesham Forest.
And it's a case that continues to baffle researchers and fuels speculation to this day.
Okay, so we have Rendlesham, which happened before Nick Pope's time at the Ministry of Defense. But let's move on to a case that happened during his tenure, the Cosford incident.
Ah, yes, March 1993. Pope was actually the head of the UFO program at that time, and this incident was a big one. Unlike Rendlesham, which was confined to a specific location, the Cosford incident involved a wave of sightings that spanned several hours and a huge geographical area.
So we're not talking about one or two isolated reports here. This was widespread.
Dozens of witnesses, including police officers, military personnel, even a meteorological officer at an RAF base. These were people trained to observe and identify aircraft, and they were seeing something truly out of the ordinary.
So what exactly were they reporting?
Many of them described seeing a huge triangular craft moving slowly overhead, sometimes described as being as large as a football field.
A football field? That's massive. What else did they say about these sightings?
Well, the sheer size of the craft was definitely striking, but they also described it hovering silently, then accelerating at incredible speeds, like way beyond what our current understanding of physics would allow for.
Definitely doesn't sound like your typical aircraft. And there was something else too, wasn't there? I remember reading about a humming sound associated with these objects, like a low-frequency hum.
Yes, and that's another interesting detail because a similar humming sound was reported in the Rendlesham Forest incident too.
Oh, wow. You're right. So we've got these massive, silent, physics-defying craft, and they hum. That's a pretty unsettling combination.
To say the least. It definitely suggests some kind of advanced technology that we just don't understand.
So what else happened during the Cosford incident? What were some of the most notable sightings?
Well, one of the most detailed accounts came from that meteorological officer at RAF Shawbury we mentioned earlier. He observed this massive triangular craft moving slowly overhead, emitting that strange humming sound.
And this guy was trained to identify aircraft, right? So he would know if this was something out of the ordinary.
Exactly. And he was so startled by what he saw that he contacted Nick Pope directly, giving a very detailed description of the object's size and shape, the sound, the way it suddenly accelerated away at an impossible speed.
And it accelerated without making a sonic boom, right? Like it just defied the laws of physics.
Exactly. And that detail is what leads some researchers to speculate about what they call transmedium travel. The idea that these objects can transition seamlessly between different environments like air to water or air to space.
It's like those stories about UFOs diving into the ocean and disappearing, or shooting straight up into the atmosphere.
Yeah. And if that's truly what's happening, it suggests a level of technology far beyond anything we currently possess.
This must have been quite a headache for Nick Pope trying to make sense of something like this while heading up the UFO program.
To say the least. But despite all the evidence and the official investigations, no definitive explanation was ever found for the Cosford incident.
Another mystery for the files. But the Cosford and Rendlesham cases have a lot of similarities, don't they?
They do. The multiple witnesses, the physical evidence, those strange humming sounds, the apparent defiance of physics, it all suggests that we might be dealing with something far more advanced and unknown than we realize.
I'm starting to see why this topic has captured people's imaginations for so long.
It's a mystery that refuses to go away. And the more we learn, the more questions we seem to have.
Well, speaking of questions, there was one more case from Nick Pope's time at the Ministry of Defense that I wanted to ask you about, and it involves a shape that we've already touched on a couple of times today.
The Black Triangle.
That's the one. Tell me about the Calvine photo.
This happened in August of 1990. Two hikers were walking near Calvine in Scotland when they saw this thing, hovering silently in the sky. It was a clear day, and they managed to take a very clear photograph of it before it shot off into the distance.
This wasn't just some blurry blob then. We're talking about a clear image of this, whatever it was.
The Calvine photo is considered one of the most compelling UFO images ever captured, and it shows a diamond-shaped craft hovering in the sky.
Wow. So what happened to the photo? Did anyone ever figure out what this diamond-shaped object was?
Well, the hikers turned the photo over to the Daily Record newspaper, hoping to get some answers, but the paper ended up handing it over to the Ministry of Defense.
Oh, interesting. So the government got their hands on it.
They did. And despite investigations by both British and American authorities, no definitive explanation was ever found for what appeared in that photograph. The case was even bounced back and forth between the UK and US governments, with each denying responsibility for the object.
Passing the buck on a cosmic scale.
Exactly. But the Calvine case just adds to the growing list of unexplained incidents that suggests something truly strange is happening in our skies.
It's clear that something's going on, but the big question is, what is it? And why all the secrecy? If they know something, why aren't they telling us?
That's a question a lot of people are asking, and it's one we'll delve into in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we spent the first part of this deep dive talking about some pretty compelling UFO cases, the kind that even someone like Nick Pope, with all his experience investigating these things, found difficult to dismiss.
And yet, despite all this evidence, all these credible witnesses, there's still this wall of secrecy surrounding the whole topic of UFOs.
It's almost like the more we learn, the less we understand.
It can be frustrating, right? But I think it's important to try and understand the reasons behind this government silence, because it's not always as simple as just a big cover-up.
Right, there are a lot of different factors at play here.
Absolutely. Like, one of the most obvious concerns, especially when we're talking about military sightings, is national security.
That makes sense. No country wants to admit they have objects flying around in their airspace that they can't identify or control.
It makes them look vulnerable, right? Like they can't even protect their own borders.
And you mentioned earlier that there are concerns about adversaries exploiting that perceived vulnerability.
Exactly. If a country publicly admits they're clueless about these objects, it could encourage rivals to test their defenses, to see how far they can push the boundaries.
So they're basically playing strategic game, keeping their cards close to their chest.
Exactly. They might know more than they're letting on, but they're not going to reveal their hand just yet.
But national security doesn't explain everything, right? There's got to be more to it than that.
Oh yeah, national security is just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Nick Pope also talked about the potential societal implications of disclosure, especially when it comes to religion.
Oh, right. That's a big one. Imagine the fallout if government suddenly confirmed that we're not alone in the universe. That could seriously shake things up for a lot of people.
You're talking about people questioning their faith, maybe even abandoning it altogether. It could lead to a real crisis of faith for some.
And even if religious leaders try to incorporate the idea of extraterrestrial life into their existing doctrines, it could lead to, infighting, different interpretations, maybe even splinter groups forming.
It's about maintaining social order to a certain extent, making sure people don't freak out and society doesn't fall apart.
I see your point, but what about the argument that the public has a right to know? That we deserve transparency on this issue?
Oh, it's a valid argument for sure, and it's one that's gaining a lot of traction these days as more and more people demand answers from their governments.
But how do you balance that right to know against the potential risks we've been talking about?
That's the million-dollar question. It's a tough balancing act. And then there's also the issue of trust.
Or rather, the lack of trust. Let's be honest, there's a lot of skepticism out there when it comes to anything the government says about UFOs.
I mean, can you blame people?
Yeah.
We've had decades of secrecy, official denials, often with really flimsy explanations.
And that just makes people even more suspicious, right?
Absolutely. It creates this vicious cycle where people are primed to distrust anything the government says on this topic.
It's like a catch-22. They've created this situation where even if they did come forward with evidence, people would probably just assume it was another cover-up.
And that lack of trust is a huge hurdle for anyone pushing for more transparency on this issue.
Yeah, you're fighting an uphill battle there.
But there's another layer to this secrecy that I think we need to talk about.
Yeah.
Something that Nick Pope hinted at in his interview.
He talked about how there was pressure to downplay or even dismiss certain cases, even when the evidence was strong, right?
Exactly. He didn't come right out and say it, but he seemed to be suggesting that there might be something more going on than just withholding information.
Like actively suppressing evidence, trying to discredit witnesses,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting into the realm of speculation here, but it's worth considering, especially coming from someone who was literally in charge of investigating UFOs for the British government.
If he felt that pressure, imagine what it must be like for researchers and whistleblowers outside the system.
It's a bit unnerving, right? Makes you wonder about what's really going on behind closed doors.
It almost sounds like they're afraid of something, like they're trying to control the narrative.
And that raises the question, why? Why go to such lengths to keep this stuff under wraps?
I mean, assuming they are suppressing information, which we can't say for sure.
Right, we're just speculating here. But if they are, what are their motives? Is it about maintaining power, avoiding panic, protecting certain interests? Or is it something else entirely? We just don't know.
Okay, so let's entertain some of those more out there theories for a minute. Why might governments go to such lengths to bury information about UFOs?
Well, one of the most popular theories is that they've recovered crashed alien spacecraft, and they're trying to reverse engineer the technology.
Like in Independence Day.
Exactly. It's a classic sci-fi trope, but some people believe it's actually happening. The idea is that governments are keeping it all hush-hush to maintain a technological advantage over their rivals.
A kind of cosmic arms race?
Right. And then there's the theory that governments are in contact with extraterrestrials, but they're keeping it secret to avoid, mass hysteria and social breakdown.
So more like a rival then, where they're trying to figure out how to communicate with these beings without causing a global meltdown.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then you have theories that go even further, suggesting that governments might be collaborating with extraterrestrials, maybe even working together on some kind of secret agenda.
Okay, now that's where I start to get a little skeptical.
I mean, it's all speculation at this point, right? We have no evidence to support any of these theories.
Fair enough. But even if we stick to the more plausible explanations, the ones we talked about earlier, like national security and social stability, the question remains, how does this lack of transparency impact our understanding of the UAP phenomenon?
Well, for one thing, it creates a breeding ground for misinformation, speculation, and distrust. It becomes really hard to separate fact from fiction when you're dealing with a topic that's shrouded in so much secrecy and ambiguity.
It allows all those wild theories to flourish.
Exactly. People crave explanations, and when the official channels aren't providing any, they tend to fill in the blanks themselves, often with whatever makes the most sense to them, regardless of how outlandish it might be.
So instead of having a rational, evidence-based conversation about UFOs, we end up with this mess of hoaxes, conspiracy theories, and genuine reports all mixed together.
It becomes almost impossible to have a meaningful discussion about what could be one of the most important issues facing humanity.
And I think it's important to remember that there's a human cost to all this secrecy, too. If something truly extraordinary is happening and we're being kept in the dark, it can create a real sense of unease, even anxiety.
Absolutely. That feeling of powerlessness, of not having control over your own reality, can lead to all sorts of negative consequences, like paranoia, alienation, even despair.
It's not just about hindering our understanding of UAPs, it's about affecting our mental and emotional well-being as a society.
Exactly. So the secrecy is doing damage on multiple levels.
Okay, so let's try to bring this all together. We've got these compelling cases, we've got government secrecy and potential suppression of information, and we've talked about the impact this is having on society. But what does it all mean?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that we're still grappling with.
I mean, if even a fraction of these UAP sightings represent something truly extraterrestrial, the implications are enormous.
It would fundamentally change everything we think we know about our place in the universe. Our history, our science, our philosophy, our religion, everything.
Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, that governments did come forward tomorrow and confirm the existence of extraterrestrial life. What would that look like? What kind of impact might we see?
Well, I think the first thing that would happen is that science would be completely revolutionized. The discovery of advanced alien technology could lead to breakthroughs in fields like physics, propulsion, energy, material science. I mean, who knows what kind of amazing things we could learn from them.
Scientists would be going crazy trying to figure out how all this new tech works.
Oh yeah, it would be a scientific gold rush. We might even be able to solve some of humanity's biggest challenges, like energy scarcity, climate change, incurable diseases. But it's important to remember there could be downsides too.
Like what?
Well, such a drastic advancement in technology could disrupt existing industries and economies. It could lead to job losses, social unrest, maybe even global instability. And then there's the danger of misuse.
Oh, right. We humans have a tendency to weaponize anything we can get our hands on. So who knows what kind of havoc we could wreak with alien tech.
It's a double-edged sword for sure. Amazing potential, but a lot of risks too.
Okay, so science and technology would obviously be impacted. But what about religion? I can't even begin to imagine what that conversation would look like.
Well, think about it. The idea that humans are unique, created in God's image, that's a central tenet of many religions.
And discovering other intelligent beings out there kind of throws a wrench into that whole idea, doesn't it?
It forces us to re-examine some of our most fundamental beliefs. Some might embrace it, seeing it as evidence of God's boundless creation. Others might reject it outright, doubling down on their existing beliefs.
It could be very divisive.
It's hard to predict how it would all play out, but the impact on religious belief would be undeniable.
And how about the average person on the street, someone who's not necessarily involved in science or theology? How might this affect their daily life?
It really depends on the nature of these extraterrestrials. Are they friendly, hostile, indifferent? Do they even care about us?
That's a lot of unknowns to process.
It is. It could lead to all sorts of reactions: excitement, fear, awe, confusion. But even the simple knowledge that we're not alone would change how we see ourselves and our place in the universe.
It's a humbling thought, realizing that we're not the center of everything.
But it could also be empowering, realizing that we're part of something much bigger than ourselves.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think the impact of disclosure depends on how we, as a species, choose to respond.
Will we rise to the occasion, or will we crumble under the weight of such a revelation?
It's a defining moment for humanity, and we need to start having these conversations now so that we're prepared for whatever the future holds.
Okay, so we've covered national security, societal impacts, scientific implications, religious ramifications. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
And there's just the tip of the iceberg. We haven't even touched on the philosophical questions.
Like, what does it mean to be human in a universe filled with other intelligent life?
Exactly. We're talking about re-examining the limits of our knowledge, the boundaries of our understanding, even the nature of reality itself.
So, where do we go from here? What do we do with all this information?
Well, I think the first step is acknowledging that this is a serious issue that deserves our attention. We need to demand transparency from our governments, encourage open dialogue, and support scientific inquiry into the UAP phenomenon.
We can't just pretend it's not happening or that it doesn't matter.
Exactly. We need to be prepared as individuals and as a society for the possibility that we're not alone in the universe. And that preparation starts with awareness and understanding.
Okay, so we've laid out the big picture, explored the complexities of government secrecy, talked about the potential implications of extraterrestrial life. It's a lot to take in, but it's important stuff.
Absolutely. And it's just the beginning of the conversation. There's so much more to explore, so many more questions to ask.
And speaking of exploring, we've got one more piece of this puzzle to examine before we wrap things up.
Ah, yes. The New Jersey drone swarm mystery. The one that's been making headlines recently.
It's a real head-scratcher, and it brings a lot of these themes we've been discussing into sharp focus. So let's dive into that in the final part of our deep dive. Okay, so we've spent this deep dive going down the rabbit hole of historical UFO cases, government secrecy, and even pondering the what-ifs of extraterrestrial contact, the big picture stuff.
The big questions.
Right. But now I think it's time to bring things back down to earth, so to speak, and look at a case that's unfolding right now, right here in the U.S.
The New Jersey drone swarm mystery.
That's the one. It seems like everyone's talking about it, and it really highlights a lot of the challenges we face when we're dealing with, these unexplained phenomena in the modern world.
Absolutely. Especially in the age of social media where information and misinformation spread so quickly.
So for those who haven't been following the news as closely as we have, can you give us a rundown of what's been happening in the skies over New Jersey?
Well, for the past few weeks, there have been numerous reports of large drone swarms appearing over different parts of New Jersey.
Swarms, plural. That doesn't sound like just a few kids playing with their toys.
No, not at all. Witnesses have described seeing dozens, sometimes even hundreds, of these drones flying in formation, often at night.
Hundreds? That's a lot of drones.
And that's just one of the things that makes this case so intriguing, right? The sheer number of drones involved, combined with their unusual behavior.
Okay, so what kind of unusual behavior are we talking about? Because I know you can buy drones that fly in formation these days, like for light shows and things.
Right, but this is different. Witnesses have reported these drones engaging in strange flight patterns, hovering for long periods, then suddenly darting off at high speeds. Some reports even describe them flying out over the ocean, disappearing from sight, then reappearing later.
So this is beyond your typical commercial or recreational drone activity.
Way beyond. I mean, think about the logistics involved in coordinating a swarm of hundreds of drones. It would require sophisticated software, advanced communication systems, and a lot of resources.
So the big question is, who's behind this? And what's their purpose?
Well, nobody's claiming responsibility, and that's part of the mystery.
Which, of course, leads to all sorts of speculation, right? Is it a secret government project, foreign espionage, maybe even aliens?
It's easy to jump to conclusions, especially when you have so little information to go on. And let's be honest, the lack of official explanation from the authorities just fuels that speculation.
It creates this void that people are eager to fill with their own theories, no matter how far-fetched.
And that's the danger.
Yeah.
Right. We end up in a situation where it's almost impossible to separate fact from fiction.
So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to make of all this?
Well, I think the New Jersey drone swarm mystery is a perfect example of what we've been talking about throughout this deep dive. It's a reminder that we live in a world where the boundaries between the known and the unknown are constantly shifting.
And that we need to be prepared for the unexpected.
Exactly. We need to be open-minded, but also critical thinkers. We need to be curious, but also cautious. And we need to demand transparency from our leaders and institutions.
Because at the end of the day, we all deserve answers.
We do. And I think the search for those answers is what makes this whole topic so fascinating and so important.
So that brings us to the end of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today.
A lot of ground. From historical cases to government secrecy, from the potential implications of extraterrestrial life to the very real mystery unfolding over New Jersey.
It's a lot to process, I know. But hopefully we've given you some food for thought.
And maybe even inspired you to do some digging of your own.
Because that's really what it's all about, isn't it? Never stop questioning, never stop exploring.
And never lose that sense of wonder.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of UAPs. Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies and keep those critical thinking caps on.